Hello everyone, welcome to the Urbis Dialogues. Today's topic is what is the relationship between livability, sustainability, and resilience? Let's start with a brief technical introduction from Louisa Rice of the Berkeley Technical Center.
Thank you very much, David. Also from my side, a warm welcome to this webinar. We're very happy to have you here. I will shortly introduce.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Urbis Dialogues. Today's topic is what is the relationship between livability, sustainability, and resilience? Let's start with a brief technical introduction from Louisa Rice of the Berkeley Technical Center.
Thank you very much, David, for this introduction. Also from my side, a warm welcome to this webinar. I will shortly have a few words on how we use the system. So for the duration of the presentations given, you will all be muted, but we are very happy to receive your questions typed. So please type your questions in the question box that you see in front of you. And then during the question and answer session that we have in the end of the webinar, we are very happy to get back to these questions. If you have any technical problems, please also feel free to type them. I'm happy to assist you as far as I can. I hope you enjoy this webinar with us.
Thank you, Louisa. As I said, this is the webinar series from Urbis, the Urban Biosphere Initiative. The series is called the Urbis Dialogues. It's a webinar series designed to address urban challenges and share experiences and connect people around the world who are working on these issues in biosphere. The Urban Biosphere Initiative is a collaboration of a variety of organizations, and the Secretariat is strictly in Cape Town. The board is listed there on the top of the screen. The Urbis Dialogue series is a 15-event webinar series that's meant to be a global platform for online dialogue. So the first Thursday of every month, and archived and recorded so you can come back and see them later. Brings together representatives of cities and local governments and experts around the world, meant to share experiences and address specific urban challenges that other people can use in their own work in cities. It's meant to support social development in a rapidly urbanizing world. The next Urbis Dialogue will be held in November, and it's called Ecosystem Services Part 2, Transferring Knowledge into Useful Action Policy, November 5th, and it's led by the local team at the UN University. As we talk about today, the connection between livability, resilience, and sustainability, the very first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of cities do we want? What is the vision of cities we want? Well, the first thing they need to be is livable. They also need to be resilient. And finally, they need to be sustainable. There on the bottom left is a picture of Bandra Beach, a public space created along the coastline in Mumbai. In the middle is a picture of Jamaica Bay, a green space which protects New York City from storm surge. You can run into New York City and over Jamaica Bay. And on the right, there's a community garden in Kampala. One of the things that happens a lot in urban planning and urban scholarship is that we think of these three things as separate streams of thought. we think of sustainability science, we think of resilience, we think of livability. But they're not three separate things. They're actually related to each other. And many of the solutions that we would have to those three things are related to each other. Now, there's severe challenges all around the world. Severe challenges are loss of open space, loss of nature, unsustainability, vulnerability to storms, injustice. These kind of problems exist all around the world. Pollution. I think we're all very familiar with these problems. And they're essentially problems of resilience, sustainability, livability, and justice. And one of the things that we want to talk about in this webinar today is that these three goals, these three linked goals that we have to see, also are linked in solutions. And those links largely are found in the idea of community building and nature-based solutions, social and system solutions. That is, that if we believe that nature and open space are important solutions for city building, those solutions address many of our problems in livability, resilience, and sustainability. That's the topic of our webinar today. We have three speakers that I want to address. My name is David Maddox. I'm the fourth. My name is David Maddox. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Nature of City. We also have with us Richard Friend. Richard is a senior scientist with the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition and the director of its regional office in Bangkok. Elisabeth Peyroux is a senior researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. And Mary Rowe is executive vice president of the Municipal Art Society in New York. We're going to start with Mary. Mary Rowe is executive vice president of the Municipal Art Society in New York. MAS is a century-old advocacy organization working to promote the livability and resilience of New York City. She has worked in New Orleans at the Institute for Resilience and Innovation, a loose alliance of initiatives that emerged in response to the systemic collapses of 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. Previous positions include being president of Ideas That Matter, a convening and publishing program based on the work of Jane Jacobs and Toronto. And she has contributed to several volumes on urban life with a particular interest in self-organization. Please welcome Mary Rowe.
Thank you, David. I'm very pleased to be part of this and looking forward to the discussion that I'm going to have with my colleagues. And I'm about to start with some slides. I've had to go to the telephone because for some reason the sound wasn't working on my computer. So I am hopeful that you can hear me and that you're able to see my slides. And I will now put this in the appropriate format so that you can see what I'm doing and what I'm talking about. I'm very interested. Whoops, I know this is the wrong. There we go. I know that I'm very interested in this topic because I think that I've had this conversation with a number of people over the years about why did resilience sort of arrive as a term that hijacked sustainability, and I wrestle with that myself, and I think that the best solution is the one we've chosen, which is to try to integrate these discussions and say that actually sustainability, livability, and resilience are three sides of the same stool, and that we need to find ways to integrate our understandings of them. And I can tell you more personally why I had a reaction to not necessarily choosing one term over the other, but actually trying to make the point that these things coexist. In terms of my understanding of the way a city works, the city is a range of different kinds of capital that operate: social capital and spiritual capital and natural capital and financial capital, and they interact and create that kind of image that I'm suggesting there, a kind of fractal-like image of interactions, and that you can see that in terms of energy flows, you can see that in terms of capital flows of all different kinds, and that the way that resilience sort of arrived on the scene for me was that I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and we were trying to really struggle with the notion of how you could get an integrated approach to understanding how cities actually evolve, and that looking at these things in isolation wasn't a very useful thing, despite the fact that that had been the practice really in planning, was to have separate kinds of conversations, and city governments are often structured in these heavily siloed ways. So you can see here we looked at resilience and realized it was a term, an evolutionary term that was in so many domains. It was used in psychology, it was used in science, natural sciences, and it was used in ecology worlds. And so from that point of view, I've enjoyed the flexibility of the term and the way that it applies to understanding broader understandings of how city processes occur. So I work for the Municipal Art Society, which is a century-old, as David suggested, civic organization here in the city of New York, focused on the built environment of the city. And what we've discovered is that the best way for us to look at the concretizing of the way a city develops so that it could be livable and sustainable and resilient is to mobilize the diversity of the city, whether that's people or places or uses or functions. And after Sandy, we had an abrupt kind of reminder of this because we had to mobilize a lot of people to start focusing on what was at risk here in this region, particularly around stormwater and sudden coastal events. And this notion of how a city actually functions, really cities are enablers of self-organization. That's the point that I always try to make, is that what we want are these kinds of dense interactions that dense urban agglomerations can make possible so that we can actually collectively create something larger than we would if we were living more isolated. And you see that kind of self-organizing pattern occurring in nature and the ways in which nature builds these kinds of webs and interconnections. And so for me, these kinds of images that I'm putting up here, like this one, really is, to me, we really, if you watch the way cities develop, they develop very much in this kind of organic style. And for us, the ultimate reason for that is to maximize the diversity of the ingredients of urban life. And so I used a quote here of Wade Davis, who I'm so fond of, who's an ecologist, but who will be known to many of our listeners well. And he's making the argument around the strength of diversity in terms of what it's doing in the natural world. But you'll see in this quote here, he refers actually to the diversity as we see it in the human world too, that these are all connected concepts. So for us, in terms of the way that these things have to coexist, the argument that we're making is that when municipal governments or federal governments or private industry look at making investments in cities, they need to be making investments that deliver multiple benefits, that actually speak to both livability and resilience. This is a wonderful community center in Paris, in a low-income neighborhood, an old coffin factory that's been converted into an arts and incubator center, and creates these kinds of opportunities for building social capital for these different kinds of interactions. In my view, strengthening the livability of the neighborhood, the resilience of the neighborhood, and ultimately encouraging a kind of approach to sustainability that's integrated across sectors and disciplines. Similarly, these kinds of things that we again naturally see forming up in communities, that people naturally want places where they can actually be with one another. In some cases, these are commercial establishments. And in some cases, they are programmatic. Like this is a walk that we're leading, part of an international movement called Jane's Walk, which has local people leading local walks in neighborhoods. Another way to provide that kind of connective tissue that to me is that it provides the sort of underpinning of these three concepts: livable, resilient, and sustainable. And technology is playing a big role in this as well. That technology gives us now platforms where we can actually provide connection again. And this organization, Meetups, is one of the largest social networking organizations in the world, with thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have an idea, decide they want to get a couple of other people to have it with them, put these things up, and then people can find each other. It's extraordinary. So the simplest image that I always use around, if you think of the way that the natural world functions, it functions by creating these connections. And I think that in neighborhoods and in cities, we're always looking for ways to create these two very, very simple concepts: hubs, places where people and activities and things of similarity congregate, and then links that bring the kind of diversity and exchange and interaction between them. So we've seen this manifest again post-Sandy here. Technology enabled us to be more connected with one another, be able to respond to the needs of people that were directly affected by that storm event, and actually connect our contributions to people's recovery through technology was made much, much more efficient so that we could actually respond directly. This is a neighborhood that we're working in here in New York. This is, as you can see, dominated by public housing. It's a low-income neighborhood that I would argue it doesn't look very resilient or sustainable or livable. This is Brownsville, New York. Tremendous resources of people and ingenuity and opportunity, but tremendous disconnections and challenges. So when you're working in a neighborhood like this, you have to be thinking about investments that benefit all three of these concepts, in my view. A couple of very quick examples, and then I'll surrender the screen back to my colleagues. This is a shot that David and I others saw. This is a municipal investment in Medellin, Colombia, where they were actually putting together these wonderful cable cars so that better connecting the different neighborhoods in Medellin so that people could actually have connection with one another, get to work, get to school, get to their jobs that they had not been able to do prior. And when they invested in that infrastructure, they also did that. They put a library in the terminus of the cable car. So again, building social capital, contributing obviously into natural capital here, and all the other kinds of benefits that these kinds of investments made. And a couple of quick slides. These are from New Orleans. This is immediately after Katrina. Well, it's about 2 months after Katrina. You can still see garbage on the streets. But this notion that the resilience of human beings that actually say, wait a minute, we are persistent. We will maintain our place. And in New Orleans, we found that communities found these ways to form these kinds of congregations of hubs of connections, as informal as they could be, just so that they could create these opportunities for interaction, which in my view are these underpinnings of resilience and livability. Similarly in Sandy, the same kind of resilience, the same kind of stubbornness. We're not going anywhere. And in Staten Island after Sandy, these kinds of events occurred all the time to bring people together. And then it concretized in the technology world here in New York City, where Airbnb, the digital platform to share living space and accommodation, came after Sandy and made thousands and thousands of rooms available to people to share who were displaced. So we here at MAS have started to focus on this notion of the civic commons and shared spaces as being so critical to the three concepts. And we have continued advocacy to create these kinds of spaces that you see in different kinds of cities that provide these links, these opportunities. We're even trying to imagine this in terms of key transportation hubs, neighborhood hubs. This is a conception of Penn Station on the west side of Manhattan here. And this is another shot of Medellin where that's David and I standing at the top of this wonderful system of connective tissue that Medellin also did. In addition to those cable cars, they put these wonderful escalators in. And they've also built this wonderful walkway that connects people across, so they can physically walk across the tops of the hillsides to actually, again, reconnect themselves. So for us, this notion of resilience here, I think you could synonymously replace that center circle with livability and with sustainability, and suggest that they are, in fact, all played in on by these concepts of social inclusion, the built environment, how the city is governed, and how the economy functions. And then this is just my last slide, which is just to remind people that this is the kind of spontaneous kind of activity. This is on a corner in New Orleans. There's a very famous graffiti artist, Banksy, who put this wonderful image of a young girl with an umbrella to protect herself from the rain. And neighbors have come and put a piece of plexiglass over this to preserve this image and just to remind us of the poignancy of city building and how we need to integrate these concepts. Thanks very much, David, and Urbis. I'm delighted to be part of it. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mary. I want to remind everybody in the crowd that you're welcome to put questions into the question box, type them, and we'll address them at the end. Next up is Elisabeth Peyroux. Elisabeth is Senior Researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. As an urban geographer, she has specialized in urban governance, urban restructuring, and social spatial transforming in Southern Africa, and particularly in Johannesburg. She is engaged in debates about resilience and sustainable urban development and has been involved in the EU-funded Chance to Sustain research program about cities in the Global South. Her current work focuses on the international circulation of urban policy models and the increasing role of cities in international affairs. Elisabeth, welcome.
Hello? I'm
Hello.
sorry, I don't. Oh, okay. I think we were cut off. I'm sorry. I didn't. I don't hear you properly.
You're on now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So thank you very much for the introduction. In this presentation, I will discuss the relationship. Sorry, I have technical issue to. Sorry, just. Yeah, sorry for the technical problem. So in this presentation, I will discuss the relationship between the three notions from a policy-making perspective. And I'm drawing here on the work I did on urban planning in Johannesburg, more particularly on the Joburg long-term development strategy that was released by the Metropolitan Authorities in 2011. So I think Johannesburg is an interesting case for our discussion, as the Metropolitan Authority uses the three notions of resilience, sustainability, and livability in a complementary perspective, and they claim a shift in understanding cities and a shift in policy making. So what I will do is I will start off with some preliminary remarks about the three notions, how they are debated in the academic literature. Then I will briefly explain how and why they are articulated in the context of Johannesburg, and at the end I will raise some issues that I think are important to consider in these debates. So questioning the relationship between the three notions raises a number of issues, and I think Mary has also touched upon those issues. First, the three notions have different meanings and understandings, both in the scientific and practitioner literature. So definition and approach to resilience vary according to the epistemology roots of the discipline in which the notion is used, natural sciences versus social sciences. It's also vary according to the discipline of social sciences. It can be different if we talk about resilience in psychology or in sociology, and also according to the object of research or to the sector under consideration. And defining resilience today has been further complicated by the fact that it has translated into the field of urban planning, and it's now applied to a city as a whole. Second, these notions are widely debated, and either their relevance and validity are contested. So this is particularly true for the notion of sustainability and resilience that have captured a lot of criticism. Third, there is no inherent relationship between the three notions. As we have seen, they have different origins, they have different trajectories in policy discourses, and they have only been combined recently. And even most importantly, they may be contradictory. For instance, a resilient city may not be sustainable, or resilience can prevent sustainable development. And fourth, the three notions are circulating at international scale among countries and cities through influential transnational networks, organizations, and city alliances. So their meaning and understanding are also transformed through policy mobility and also through local interpretation. So what I want to highlight here is that as a result of these processes, the three notions are shaped by international mainstream discourses, and at the same time they are actor dependent and they are context specific. And I think for me they are political, as they reflect a particular vision of and conception of cities, societies, and individuals. So in the Johannesburg strategy, as I was saying, the three notions are used together simultaneously. Their definition and their articulation both reflect a mainstream discourse, as we will see, but also local reformulation. I will argue that the popularity of the three terms can be linked to the ways in which urban issues are framed today. Namely, there are three key words that have emerged and consolidated in policy discourses. It's uncertainty, unpredictability, and complexity. As we now see in many of the discourses, there is a focus on crisis, shocks, tension, conflict, disaster. They have become a prominent way of thinking about urban development processes. For instance, in Johannesburg, the city is concerned with the local impact of the financial crisis of 2008. They're also very strongly concerned about environmental risk and hazards, such as floods and water scarcity. particularly in informal settlements. They're also very much concerned about social tension and conflicts. For instance, there are mass protests against poor service delivery now in South African city. There are violent strikes. And we also have all in mind the xenophobic violence that has affected South African city in 2008 and early this year. So when we think in terms of crisis shocks, this goes along with an understanding that change is not predictable, it is not linear, it can be sudden, brutal, and disruptive. So the logical consequence of this way of thinking is that the city must cope, resist, and adapt to change, and resilience in that sense provide some way of addressing this concern. Along this line, building adaptive capacity become a key policy goal, as shown in the Johannesburg definition of resilience. So in Johannesburg, the resilience is defined in what we call a dynamic evolutionary perspective, as opposed to a static engineering one. And what it makes the specificity of Johannesburg as well, it is associated with a strong normative vision. It is rooted in a post-apartheid social transformation agenda with a focus on issue of inequalities, equity, justice, and rights. So in that general framing, resilience becomes a critical factor for sustainability, and this is where the link also can be made in this way of understanding resilience and sustainability. Now I was also mentioning the keyword of complexity. Complexity in the discourses relate to the links and interdependency between ecosystem and social system, but also the dynamic interaction between people and the environment, and also the interplay of factors and driving forces at different scales. So this complexity is taken into consideration, for instance, in the ways in which Johannesburg has formulated its challenge and the interdependency. We can see there is link across domain and across sectors. For instance, we can link issues from the economy field, like low skills, to issue from the social field, like education or health, and also to the ecology, like water scarcity. So there is a complex way of understanding challenges, and also a concern over linking those challenges across domains. The complexity also refers to the tension in policy making between different policy goals. There are strategic trade-offs to be made within a city. For instance, you can see in this diagram how to ensure, on the one hand, economic growth, competitiveness, and at the same time, economic inclusion, how to improve quality of life while maintaining environmental protection. So the complexity that are facing policymakers is also linked to this tension, even contradiction between policy goals. And I think resilience, sustainability, and livability is a way to manage this tension and a way to address this potential contribution. So in this framing, sustainability here brings the long-term perspective, a city or a system that has the capacity to maintain or reproduce itself. It also brings the focus on environmental issues, so what we call the carrying capacity of city. So in such discourse, sustainability as well as resilience share the ability to address the issue of complexity. And I think it's interesting to see that resilience is perceived as having a strong analytical potential. It seems to provide a way to understand how the different components of a system interact and produce positive or negative outcomes. And also what I think makes resilience distinctive from sustainability, not only its analytical potential, but also that resilience has a focus on both prevention and adaptation, whereas sustainability can be seen as only dealing with safeguarding and maintaining a system. So livability also comes in the equation. It's also the concept of livability also connects the physical environment with the people, and it is interesting to see that it has started to overlap with sustainability around the issue of quality of life and well-being. But sustainability is about the long-term perspective, and I would say that the livability notion is about the here, about the now, and about to be. So livability brings a focus on the local scale, about social and physical environment, public amenities, infrastructures. It also brings the people-centered perspective. You know that livability is associated with personal development, health, well-being. Livability is also associated to subjective perception. People perceive needs. So it's deal also with individuals and community. So it has also this people-centered perspective that brings a complementary one on the other one. And also, most importantly, in the way that Johannesburg is using the concept of livability, it brings social values, equity, dignity, and empowerment of people. So just to conclude from this part, the three notions in the context of Johannesburg are articulated analytically. They are linked in terms of policy goals, and they share common social values. So basically, what they are showing to us is that they try to have a holistic, systemic, multidisciplinary perspective on the city, and also a normative vision, a social and a political agenda. However, I see some problems and limitations with using the three notions. We can see that the multidisciplinary perspective on cities and cross-sectoral integration is highly relevant in long-term planning, but in a way they conflate different conceptions of city. As you can see on the screen, we have the sociological perspective that will take as an object of research ecosystem that will apply logical metabolism model, but at the same time, because of this integrated perspective, we will also have the socio-psychological dimension, and now they don't focus on ecosystem, on individuals, on social groups, on communities. So this is a different way of approaching issues of resilience and sustainability with human development approach and also the influential capability approach. There is also dominant in these discourses the political economy perspective, the way cities are now considered as open, relational places within multi-scalar networks. Cities are made of social and cultural diversity, diverging and competing interests. So what we see here is that this poses to us scientific analytical problems because each perspective, each conception has its own theoretical, conceptual, and analytical framework. They rely on different understanding on the relationship between people, the environment, and among people. So this leads also us to operationalization problem. How to measure and monitor resilience? Resilience of what? Are we talking about the urban system, the city as a whole, individual, particularly vulnerable social groups? Also question on how to infer resilience from such a diverse conception of our living environment. Also, it's very difficult to have an objective assessment of livability because we have seen that it is important to have subjective perception. So how do we assess livability? How do we take into consideration the diversity of perception and needs of people? Another problem that I see is that resilience brings a political ambivalence. There are underlying, often implicit political and ideological assumptions behind resilience, and the literature, the critical literature has shown it very well. It's based on a neoliberal conception of society. It can be used to justify and promote individual responsibility and adaptability, but promoting what they call self-sufficiency can justify the withdrawal of long-term permanent state support to poor and vulnerable people under the guise of so-called responsibilization and empowerment. And in South Africa, this shows the tension and contradiction between, on the one hand, the expected role of development state in a strong context of social inequalities, and on the other hand, this rhetoric of self-responsibilization and individual adaptability. Also, resilience, sustainability, and livability should be open, pluralistic, subjective, and contextual vision. There is no general standard expectation for sustainability and livability. So that for me, this notion should be collectively debated within a democratic decision-making. So my conclusion will be that the three notions, once or if clearly defined, can be regarded as complementary to each other in an attempt to grasp the complexity of urban challenges. They, however, fuse different concepts and approaches from various disciplines that really raise analytical as well as operational issues, and the underlying assumption must be explicit as well as the political framing. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Next up is Richard Friends. Richard is Senior Scientist with the Institute for Social and Environmental Transition and the Director of the Regional Office in Bangkok. As co-investigator of SSHRC-IDRC's Urban Climate Resilience in South Asia Partnership, his work focuses on regionalization, urbanization, and climate change. He has more than 20 years of experience in the human development of the Mekong region. His recent writing has included the United Nations Human Development Report for Cambodia, called Building Resilience, the Future of Rural Livelihoods in the Face of Climate Change. And his research explores how multi-scale and interlinked complex systems of infrastructure and technology create new patterns of vulnerability and poverty. Richard is interested in the governance dimensions of urban sustainability and resilience, particularly how the urban future is to be shaped, for whose benefits and by whom. Welcome, Richard. Richard, you want to make sure
good evening, everybody. Good evening from Bangkok. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. This evening I thought I would give you some insights from Southeast Asia, from the city of what is known as the City of Angels, and really think about these issues around what we are building livability, sustainability, resilience of, and who is to benefit, and who is making decisions about this urban future. And really in doing so, I'm drawing on my own involvement in a series of resilience building, urban resilience building projects, and an attempt really to reclaim the urban agenda, particularly from a growing trend to emphasize the role of financing and building of infrastructure as the cornerstone of building resilience, and really to reclaim a sort of a rights agenda for urban futures. And as with the other speakers, I'm also concerned with the way the current urban agenda is moving forward. So let me give you a little tour of Bangkok. Excuse me. So, not so long ago, Bangkok was known as Venice of the East. It was a city that was built around waterways, and its main transport was through the water system. And it was a city built within this huge delta system of the Chao Phraya Basin, designed with houses on stilts, designed very much to deal with the natural cycle of flood and recession, and very much shaped by the ecological conditions in which it was situated. If we move forward to more contemporary picture of Bangkok, we see a very, very different picture that has emerged, with poorer housing, moved much closer to marginal areas, particularly, as you see here, along a very poorly functioning canal system within the downtown part of the city. And there's a history to the development of Bangkok, as with many other cities in Southeast Asia, and particularly as at this present time, as we're going through one of the most dramatic and radical periods of urbanization. So this is a picture of King Cobra Swamp. If any of you have been to Bangkok, no doubt you will have passed through King Cobra Swamp, or as it is better now known nowadays as the International Airport of Suvarnabhumi. So the King Cobra Swamp is a large area of a wetland area on the east of Bangkok. There was a very productive agricultural area, and it provides a very important drainage to the rest of the city. It was targeted for development many decades ago, and the allegations are that influential people bought up the land and pushed through the plans for a international airport there, and reaping the benefits of this early investment. And really, this history of investment and speculation around land really was revealed in 2011, when we had very serious floods across Thailand that caused very serious loss of life, very, very serious damage to property. And as you see in the pictures, one from October and one from November, you can see this huge volume of water that is creeping around Bangkok. And really the main problem was not so much the volume of water, the volume of rainfall that year, but really the history of reshaping the ecological landscape of locating factories and housing estates in these core floodplain areas that had in fact been designated as green space in the urban plans. So despite plans that were based on a recognition of the ecological importance of this broader floodplain, this huge wave of investment really targeted this area. And again, what we see is a pattern of targeting investment for low-value land, and very often the low-value land is low value because it's flood-prone. The 2011 floods really had a very, very dramatic effect, not just on the way that they inundated specific areas, but the way they disrupted very complex systems, so systems of transport, systems of water, of energy, and through the effects on the industrial estates, the very complex production and trade systems on which the Thai economy is based. But you saw incredible and rather unusual adaptation to this very difficult situation. So this picture you see is of the flyovers in Bangkok. And with concerns about the floodwaters coming into the city, what many people did was they parked their cars on the flyovers. So all of these cars you see on the flyovers here are cars that are parked to avoid the floods. So this gets me to think about urban systems, and I think this is where resilience thinking has a great deal to offer, to remind us of there's something very particular about contemporary urbanization in a way that it depends very much on these complex systems of infrastructure and technology and the ways in which these are very much interlinked and interconnected. And consequently, the ways in which many of the shocks and crises are felt and reverberate through fragilities within these systems, so that the shocks and crises are felt way beyond the specific location of a particular event. And Bangkok has for many, many years been notorious for its very congested traffic, and several different attempts to try and solve this long-standing problem. Of course, the traffic situation in Bangkok, as in many cities, is highly differentiated. There are very many different kinds of transport for different kinds of people, and they're very much differentiated according to wealth or the cost of particular types of transport. The crisis around transport in Bangkok simply won't go away. This is a report from today's English language Bangkok Post, which was talking about that there are over 6 million cars registered in Bangkok and over 10 million cars coming into Bangkok every day, and 350,000 new cars have been registered for the streets of Bangkok in the first 6 months of the year. One of the great innovations that is often highly praised, and that is as having eased the traffic situation and also contributing to a new kind of green urban future for Bangkok, is the overhead SkyTrain system. As you see here, you have two very different kinds of transport systems, at least two different kinds of transport systems now, one on the road, often very congested, often with motorbikes and the public bus services that cater to a certain group of people. And you have the SkyTrain system, very comfortably air-conditioned, but largely unaffordable for the majority of people in Bangkok. But there's another side to the history of the SkyTrain system as well, because what we see is this pattern of expansion of the SkyTrain system leading to investment around that land, the building of condominiums and of shopping malls, and to the eviction of people that lived in those areas. Most people living in Bangkok do not have secure tenure. Many people have been living for many decades. Their families have been there for several generations, but they do not have any form of tenure and no form of compensation for when they are moved. So this is an area in what was 2 years ago downtown Bangkok, but still, as you can see, some fruit orchards and the condominiums rising just in the background. And very soon, as the SkyTrain system spread further, the houses of people that had been there for at least 80 years were demolished and moved away, and all this land has been bought up, and leaving very little left except for this spirit house. It's come to the point that as the SkyTrain system is extended and the investments are made, that it's very much unaffordable for most people in Bangkok. Of course, included in that group of people are the huge numbers of migrant workers that come from Cambodia and Myanmar to Bangkok. So, of course, this is not an unfamiliar story, but it's important to know what is driving urbanization and how far the motivations of urbanization and the investments in urbanization are from interests in sustainability and livability and resilience, and how issues and the discourse of particularly of resilience is now creating a very particular urban future. What we see here is a quotation from the Siam Commercial Bank that was bemoaning the very slow rates of urbanization in Thailand and the need to accelerate urbanization, and presenting an argument for urbanization very much around an economy of consumption, for a bank, of creating credit and creating debt, and really an urban future that has very little concern for the global ecological concerns and for climate change. And as Gavin Chatkin has reminded us, most of the planning processes that occur in cities like Bangkok and parts of East Asia occur with very weak governance. As I mentioned earlier, the expansion of the industrial estates and the housing estates around Bangkok that contributed to the floods were very much by abusing the planning system with no public access to information, with no degree of participation and no accountability. So we have a huge investment that has taken over any form of urban governance. And yet we see these framings around resilience becoming extremely influential in global agendas, and particularly in this part of Asia. And yet when we talk about resilience, there's very little consideration of the history, of the dynamics, and the ways in which urban space, urban living is contested. So we very much hear about resilience, but in terms of maintaining existing systems for the benefit of current structures, very much less about reshaping urban systems for other benefits and for a more equitable future. What is particularly disturbing is that the urban agenda, while it takes on the discourse of resilience, has pretty much abandoned earlier commitments to the right to the city. And the right to the city, as I'm sure everybody is familiar with, has a very long history and a very influential history. It's very disturbing that at this point these concerns could be ignored or abandoned. Of course, the right to the city is not just about rights to public space, which are, of course, are extremely important, but it's a right to be able to participate and shape the decisions that influence urban futures. One of the challenges, though, is really thinking about how these urban systems work. And this, I think, is perhaps an agenda that the rights to the city, an interest in the rights to the city agenda needs to take on board more fully. As I said before, much of the impacts of these shocks and crises are felt through the fragilities and failures of systems. And we have a warning again from a paper today about the fragility of energy systems and the energy systems on which urbanization so much depends. As I wrap up, I would like to say that the challenge really isn't simply about livability and sustainability and resilience. It really is about reimagining a very different kind of urban future, an urban future that is much more inclusive. It's very clear that urbanization that is unfolding at the moment in this part of the world in particular, the current trajectories are simply not viable, not ecologically viable, and not socially viable. And that in reclaiming and reshaping an urban agenda that talks about transformations. We need to shift our focus not merely from reducing vulnerability and poverty, which is very much the agenda of resilience, but really to enhancing well-being, freedoms, and rights. But in doing so, we must also recognize that the immediate needs of people who are disenfranchised from urbanization and suffer the immediate consequences of lack of services or the expansion of the urban area and then relocated, such as this group of slum dwellers in Thailand, really their immediate needs need to be reconciled with these longer-term needs for an urban future. And this is a debate that really hasn't occurred. And I feel that it's something that really must occur with some urgency. I would like to stop now and hand back to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. If all the panelists would unmute their mics, we can start. We have a number of questions. And I'd like for the first question to all of the panelists, really. And that is, if we all agree that there has been a segregation somehow of livability, resilience, and sustainability in urban dialogue, a lot of the questions that all three of you raised really ended up being about inequality and justice. So livability and sustainability and resilience for whom and decisions made by whom. If that's the current structure and cities have siloed or made distinct these three lines of thought, how can we reunify them in the cities that each of you work in, New York, Paris, and Bangkok, but also in other cities around the world? How can we change this segregation of these three topics? That question was to me. Are our panelists still on the line?
Sorry, David.
Yes.
So was that a question to any of us?
Yes, that was a question to any of us. How do we reunify in city planning and urban planning the ideas of livability, resilience, and sustainability? That if, as this seems to be the case, that city planning has segregated these three ideas. How do we change that?
It's a tough question to answer. I mean, I'm very intrigued by Elisabeth's presentation and what appears to be very forward thinking in the case of South Africa. And I wonder whether this kind of very different political history of South Africa, how much that has shaped a very different agenda from what we're seeing in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And again, perhaps the experience in New York demonstrates the ability of citizens to mobilize themselves and citizens to be able to hold the state to account. There's a degree of transparency and accountability in investment that doesn't really occur in many other places. And perhaps these kinds of conditions are really necessary for shifting the agenda.
Yeah, and I just wanted, it's Mary here, I just wanted to add that I think that the benefit of these three concepts is that they intersect in suggesting that livability is really about people, and sustainability could potentially be about capacity, and resilience could be actually about measurement, so that you could continue to say that you need all three in some kind of balance. Because if we get overly systematized or we get overly anecdotal, we lose the interconnection between the three.
Yes, I want to do some follow-up on Richard's comment on the specificity of the South African case study. It's very interesting to compare actually the political agenda of South African city with other cities in the world, and there's such a strong concern over overcoming the past legacy of apartheid. So it has shaped the entire political agenda for the past 20 years, and it's very, very highly explicit in any policy document that the core of the government policy is about reducing inequality, enhancing social inclusion, economic inclusion. So this is why also the South African study is also interesting when dealing with what I was mentioning about the tension and the contradiction between the policy goal. Because on the one hand, they want to follow the movement into going into economic growth and prosperity, but at the same time, they have this strong social agenda. And people in South Africa, they're also claiming their rights. There is a strong civic mobilization. So there is active driving forces also, community forces behind the political agenda that also shape the trajectory of South Africa. So we always asking ourselves whether this is a specificity linked to history, whether this is an exceptional position of South Africa within other cities. So we're really also very intrigued about what makes the specificity of the South African study, and also what we can learn from the South African case study in terms of democratic policy making, in terms of empowerment of people, and in terms also of having very strong social values entrenched in city vision and city objective. So I really think there is a scope for learning and from the South African case study.
Richard, you brought up the idea of the right to the city, which has been an important philosophical movement for a while. It's really connected to the idea of participation. But we don't talk about the right to the city so much these days. We talk more about the idea of participation. Although we talk about it a lot, we don't seem to be making a lot of progress in actually integrating participation into city planning. Is there a way forward in that regard? How can we revivify the idea of the right to the city in actual city planning?
Well, that's a very good question as well, and I'm really intrigued why it is that this earlier commitments and interest in the right to city appear to have been dropped. It's very rare in the resilience literature, or certainly in resilience practice. I mean, there's a huge amount of investment and a lot of activity around urban resilience at the moment. It's very rare to have any discussion around rights. It seems very much that the urban resilience agenda is being driven by a more neoliberal inclined agenda around investment and particularly around infrastructure, which of course is very much needed, but very much ignoring the overall purpose of that infrastructure and who would be involved in deciding what should and should not be built and what kind of benefits it should generate. So I do feel it is important to, it's intriguing why certain shifts in thinking occur. I do feel it is very important to steer us back towards thinking in terms of rights to the city. We're seeing a whole new generation of urbanization and investment and creating a whole series of path dependencies that will be very difficult to fix. So, for example, I was again intrigued both by Mary and by Elisabeth's presentations, just both by the notion of public participation and the degree to which there is public space in cities. Again, what we see in most parts of Asia is that the city is being very much privatized, both in terms of the space and in terms of the systems and services. And once that occurs, it's very difficult to reshape an urban future in any different direction.
Although I just want to jump in, it's Mary, and say that, we have ongoing issues here about the privatization of public space, and it's always raised, particularly because of scarce resources. And I guess my sense is that this is a terrain that we have to try, if we can, to be a little less ideological, if we can, and understand that it can be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. We have a fight right here in New York City, as we speak, for probably one of the highest profile public spaces we have, that has private interests in it as well and private financing in it as well. So I think these hybrid systems, as much as they make us uncomfortable and they pose risks, it's a reality of urban life, not just in the global south, but certainly here in the global north as well. And I'd like to think that there's a way for us to, because we've had, for centuries, we've had spaces that perform a civic function in a city, but are actually privately or institutionally owned, but they're still, in fact, a civic function.
We have a question from the floor that is related to this from Robin Chalot, and she points out that in ecological systems, they are fundamentally built on diversity of species, diversity of habitats, diversity of ecosystems. And in ecological theory, that diversity is a contributor to the resilience of those ecological systems, and helps them rebuild themselves after conditions of crisis. We do talk about that in social ecological systems in the urban sphere as well. Do you think that we undervalue somehow diversity of all types? Social diversity certainly, but diversity of built form, diversity of economic form. Do we ignore those things at our peril in terms of city building? Elizabeth, what is your experience in South Africa?
I'm sorry, I can't hear properly. That's what I was typing in the chat box.
And I can't either, David. We can't hear you.
Okay.
I was asking, do we undervalue diversity of all kinds when we in terms of city building? Social diversity, diversity of the built form, diversity of the relationship, the balance between private and public?
My quick answer, yes. This is Mary. Yes. And in fact, I think that the great thing is the diversity ultimately wins. But I think it just does. But I think that's one area, that's one concept that unifies the three concepts. Diversity of all kinds, uses, people, buildings, spaces, is a key ecological concept that you see that's pervading in every aspect of urban life.
Yes, I would like to add something about diversity. I think diversity in the context of unequal power relationship is very difficult to implement and to respect. And I think diversity, so that's in some context there could be a discourse about taking into consideration diversity of people, diversity of cultures. But in the way the political economy works in certain countries and cities, this diversity cannot be expressed by people because of the lack of capacity, because of the lack of rights, because also of a lack of public spaces to express their opinion and views and express this diversity. So I think this is something to value very much, but also I think something to think within a broader political economic perspective that doesn't offer people or every people the chance to express it or to have people representing their interest and their diversity. So I think that's always there was always some political issues behind diversity.
We have a question from the floor from Jose Mercado. And does the panel have any thoughts about urban changes with regard to our topic here that result from facing huge migration fluxes, for example, in European cities? How and when will the socio-ecological system go back to balance? How can we find balance? Livability, resilience, and sustainability in the face of immense migration.
David, it's hard for us to hear you. You're quite muffled. I think I heard, how do we rebalance? I think that was the question. Can we create an ecological balance? And I think there was a question about migration. Am I right? Oh, here, good. Thank you. You put it in the text box. Yes, fine, great. Yes. Well, obviously, I'll make a quick comment, too, again, from North America. In terms of influx of population, You know, the challenge that European cities are experiencing now is actually a challenge that many North American cities would love to have, because they are declining in population and unable to attract migrants. And I think it's one of the larger questions that we talk about how you can actually equip cities to be able to absorb, which they always do. But I don't disagree that there will be a transitional phase here where things will be upset, and where it will be a great challenge to the resilience of those cities to be able to absorb the populations that they're faced with. Richard, you may have a thought. Oh, sorry, Elisabeth, you're in Europe.
No, please. Now, I was just thinking of the way the question was framed, and the system should go back to a balanced state. For me, this is a very conservative way of thinking about the resilience of socio-ecological system or any social systems, because maybe the goal is not to bounce back to what it was before, but to go along with the changes like migration input, new people, and find a new trajectory, transform itself towards something new. So this balancing state for me is a bit problematic. And that goes along with this way of thinking about resilience in terms of maintaining an equilibrium at all costs and, you know, bouncing back to what it was before. So I think it's very at odds with all the transformative vision that we have of society and this constantly evolving society with new entrants, new people, diversity. So I think that's something we could think about it as well.
Yes, I think I would like to add to what Elisabeth just said. I think the socio-ecological systems perspective is very useful for understanding urbanization, but it has its limits, and I think it's also very important to have this sort of political economy perspective that understands migration in different terms, not just as an ecological movement of populations within a broader ecological system. And of course, you know, the reasons why you have sudden migration into Germany very recently, and the reasons why you have migration in Asia are very complex. But we have to recognize that in many cases, certainly the larger movements of people into cities puts them in very precarious and very vulnerable situations, and their living conditions, their access to services, and the informality of their employment and insecurity of employment are very much a feature of current migration, but very much what many of these cities depend on. And so again, I think it is important to, perhaps this is, it's not in contradiction to concepts around livability, but again, it's important to reaffirm ideas around well-being, ideas about rights, about governance and accountability and transparency.
Thank you, Richard. And let's bring a close to this webinar, What is the Relationship Between Livability, Sustainability, and Resilience? I want to thank very much the panelists, Richard Chen, Elisabeth Peyroux, and Mary Rowe. Please join us for future Urbis Dialogues. There's a website listed along the bottom where you can find more information, see recordings, and see the future schedule. Thank you very much for attending. Please come back. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.